He thought forcing her onto the stage would get a few laughs, but he had no idea he was about to silence an entire hall. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The grand recital hall at Westbridge Conservatory gleamed under warm golden lights, its polished hardwood stage stretching wide beneath a ceiling lined with crystal chandeliers. Rows of velvet seats were filled with students, faculty, and distinguished guests, their quiet conversations blending into a soft hum of anticipation. At the center of it all stood Professor Andrew Whitmore, a man known as much for his brilliance as for his sharp, cutting demeanor. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, his silver hair perfectly combed, he carried himself with the authority of someone who believed he alone defined excellence. Just beyond the stage, near the shadowed wings, Margaret Cole stood almost invisible. Her gray cardigan hung loosely over a simple blouse, her hands folded neatly in front of her as she observed the room with calm, unreadable eyes. To most people there, she was just another staff member, someone who cleaned, organized, and quietly disappeared before anyone thought to notice. And that was exactly how Margaret had lived her life inside those walls. Unseen, unheard, and underestimated. Whitmore's voice cut cleanly through the hall. As we all know, tonight's performance requires precision, discipline, and above all, talent. A faint smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth as his gaze drifted toward the wings. Unfortunately, our scheduled pianist seems to be unavailable. A ripple of murmurs passed through the audience. Students exchanged uneasy glances, while a few faculty members leaned forward, curious about what would come next. Whitmore paused deliberately, letting the tension stretch just long enough to draw every eye back to him. Then, with a subtle gesture of his hand, he pointed directly toward Margaret. "But perhaps," he said, his tone laced with quiet amusement, "we have an unexpected volunteer." The room shifted. Heads turned. A few students chuckled softly, recognizing the setup before it even fully unfolded. Margaret didn't move at first. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow around her, the distant hum of voices fading into a low, indistinct murmur. Whitmore raised an eyebrow, his expression sharpening. "Ms. Cole," he called, just loud enough for the entire hall to hear. "Would you care to assist us?" A faint wave of laughter rippled through the audience now, no longer hidden. Someone whispered, "Is he serious?" Another voice answered, "This should be interesting." Margaret stepped forward. Slowly, deliberately. Each step carried her from the shadows into the full weight of the stage lights, illuminating every detail of her modest appearance. Her shoes made soft, measured sounds against the polished floor, each one echoing faintly in the growing silence. Up close, Whitmore's smile widened slightly, though it never reached his eyes. "No need to be nervous," he said, his voice smooth but edged with condescension. "Just play something simple." Margaret met his gaze for the briefest moment. Her expression didn't change. No anger, no embarrassment, just stillness. Around them, the audience leaned in, the earlier laughter settling into a tense curiosity. Some expected a mistake. Others anticipated a quick retreat. No one expected anything remarkable. Margaret turned toward the grand piano. It sat at the center of the stage like a silent witness, its glossy black surface reflecting the overhead lights in soft, shimmering patterns. She approached it without hesitation, her posture straight, her movements precise yet unhurried. As she reached the bench, she paused. Her hand hovered just above the polished edge of the instrument, fingers relaxed, almost as if reacquainting themselves with something long familiar. Behind her, Whitmore crossed his arms, clearly satisfied with the spectacle he had created. The hall grew quieter now, the earlier whispers dissolving into a still, almost electric silence. Margaret lowered herself onto the bench. The faint creak of what seemed louder than it should have been. She adjusted her position slightly, placing both feet firmly on the floor, her back straight, her shoulders relaxed. Then, slowly, she lifted her hands. For a brief second, nothing moved. Not a breath, not a whisper. The entire hall seemed suspended in that moment, caught between expectation and disbelief. And then, her fingers descended toward the keys. The first note did not simply sound. It settled into the air like it had always belonged there, rich and controlled, carrying a depth that no one in that hall had expected from the quiet woman sitting at the piano. For a fraction of a second, a few students in the back exchanged glances, uncertain if they had heard it correctly, as if their ears needed confirmation. Then the second note followed, then the third, each one placed with such precision that the room seemed to draw in a collective breath without realizing it. Margaret's fingers moved with a calm certainty, not rushed, not hesitant, but guided by something deeper than practice alone. Professor Whitmore's faint smirk lingered for a moment longer, but it began to falter as the melody unfolded into something unmistakably refined. This was not the uneven, nervous playing he had expected. This was structure, intention, and mastery. Margaret's posture remained composed, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze lowered toward the keys, completely detached from the weight of the audience behind her. The piano responded to her touch as if it recognized her, each note blooming fully before dissolving into the next. The earlier whispers vanished entirely. Even the subtle rustling of programs stopped. The hall, once filled with anticipation for spectacle, now held something else entirely, a quiet tension that leaned closer to reverence. A student in the front row, who moments earlier had been suppressing laughter, slowly lowered his gaze, his expression shifting into confusion, then into something closer to awe. Margaret continued, her hands now moving more fluidly across the keyboard, weaving a melody that carried both restraint and emotion. It was not loud or showy. It did not demand attention. It commanded it effortlessly. Whitmore shifted his stance, uncrossing his arms as his eyes narrowed slightly. He studied her more closely now, as though searching for a flaw, a misstep, anything that would restore his control over the situation. But there was none. Every transition was seamless. Every pause was intentional. It was the kind of performance that could not be improvised by chance. Somewhere near the middle rows, one of the senior faculty members leaned forward, his brow furrowed in disbelief. He had spent decades evaluating talent, and what he was hearing did not align with the woman everyone believed Margaret to be. The realization began to spread quietly, person to person, not through words, but through the shifting posture of the audience itself. Back straightened, eyes focused, breathing slowed. Margaret's hands glided into a more complex passage, her fingers dancing lightly, yet with absolute control, as if the difficulty of the piece existed only on paper and not beneath her touch. The sound filled the hall, rising and falling in waves that felt both powerful and restrained at the same time. Whitmore took a small step back without realizing it. The confidence that had once defined his presence now seemed to thin, replaced by something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. The stage lights reflected softly off the piano's surface, casting faint glimmers across Margaret's hands as they continued their steady motion. She did not look up. She did not acknowledge the room. It was as if the audience no longer existed for her at all. And in that detachment, her control only deepened. A young pianist seated among the students felt his chest tighten as he listened, recognizing techniques he had struggled to master for years executed with effortless clarity. He leaned forward, his earlier amusement completely gone. The music reached a delicate pause, a brief moment where the final note lingered just long enough to hold the entire hall suspended in silence. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the air itself seemed still, waiting. And in that silence, something undeniable began to settle into the minds of everyone present. They had not been watching a mistake unfold. They had been witnessing something far beyond their expectations, something that quietly dismantled every assumption they had made about the woman sitting at the piano. The pause did not break. It deepened, stretching across the hall like a held breath that no one dared release. And then Margaret moved again, her fingers returning to the keys with a quiet confidence that felt almost inevitable, as if the music had not ended at all, but simply waited for her to continue. The next passage unfolded with greater complexity, the notes weaving together in layered precision, each phrase building upon the last with an elegance that could not be taught in a classroom or measured by any standard rubric. Professor Whitmore's expression tightened, his jaw setting as he stepped closer to the piano, no longer observing from a distance, but drawn in despite himself, his eyes fixed on her hands as though searching for proof that what he was hearing could somehow be explained away. But there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only control. Margaret's touch shifted subtly, bringing out a dynamic contrast that filled the room without overwhelming it, a balance that only the most seasoned performers ever truly mastered. A faint reflection of the stage lights shimmered across the polished surface of the instrument, mirroring the steady rhythm of her movement. And for the first time, the grandeur of the hall seemed smaller, as though the music itself had taken command of the space. In the audience, a senior instructor who had once performed at Carnegie Hall leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together, his eyes narrowing not in skepticism but in recognition. He had heard something like this before, years ago, in a performance that had left an entire audience standing in stunned silence. The realization flickered across his face, but he said nothing, as though speaking would somehow break whatever was unfolding in front of him. Margaret transitioned into a more demanding sequence, her left hand maintaining a steady foundation while her right hand moved with fluid precision across the higher register, each note placed exactly where it belonged, never rushed, never forced. It was not just technical skill, it was interpretation, the kind that transformed notes on a page into something alive, something that reached beyond the instrument itself. A student seated near the aisle felt a chill run down his spine, not from fear, but from the sudden awareness that he was witnessing something rare, something that did not happen often, even in a place dedicated to excellence. The earlier assumption, the quiet dismissal, all of it began to feel distant now, replaced by a growing sense of unease, as though the entire room was collectively realizing how wrong they had been. Whitmore's composure continued to slip in subtle ways, his shoulders no longer squared with certainty, his posture no longer commanding, as he watched the woman he had intended to embarrass take complete control of the moment. He opened his mouth slightly, as if to say something, then stopped, the words dissolving before they could form. There was nothing he could interrupt, nothing he could correct. The music did not allow it. Margaret remained focused, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady on the keys, as if the world beyond the piano had ceased to exist entirely. The melody began to rise, building towards something greater, something that carried weight and memory within it, each progression layered with intention. Somewhere in the back row, a quiet voice whispered, almost involuntarily, "Who is she?" But no one answered, because no one knew. And yet, as the sound filled every corner of the hall, it became clear that the question itself no longer mattered. What mattered was what they were hearing, what they were feeling, and the undeniable truth settling into the room with every passing second. This was not a performance born from chance or simple familiarity. This was the result of years, of discipline, of a depth that could not be hidden forever. The final movement of the passage approached, not with urgency, but with quiet authority, as if the music itself understood that it no longer needed to prove anything. And in that moment, as Margaret's hands prepared to carry the piece forward, the entire hall remained suspended, fully aware now that they were no longer witnessing a demonstration, but a revelation. The music did not rush toward its ending. It commanded it, unfolding with a quiet authority that made every second feel intentional, every note placed with a precision that left no room for doubt. And as Margaret's hands moved across the keys, the hall seemed to shrink further, as though the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. The melody swelled, not in volume alone but in presence, carrying a depth that resonated through the polished wood floors and into the stillness of every person seated in the room. Professor Whitmore stood frozen just a few feet away, his earlier confidence now completely absent, replaced by a growing awareness he could not escape. This was no longer his stage. It had not been for several minutes. And yet, he had been the one who placed her there. The realization settled heavily, visible in the slight tightening of his expression, in the way his posture shifted from control to something far less certain. Margaret continued without acknowledging any of it, her focus unwavering, her breathing steady, her movements fluid as if guided by memory rather than conscious effort. There was no performance in her demeanor, no attempt to impress, no glance toward the audience for validation. She played as though the music existed long before the room, and would continue long after it. In the front row, a visiting donor who had funded several scholarships leaned back slowly, his earlier polite interest replaced by something far more serious. He had attended hundreds of performances, heard countless talented students, but this was different. There was a weight to it, an authenticity that could not be manufactured. He found himself holding his breath without realizing it. A young instructor seated near the aisle pressed her hand lightly against her chest, her eyes fixed on Margaret's hands, trying to follow each movement, each transition, but falling behind, not from lack of knowledge, but from the sheer seamlessness of it all. The technical difficulty was undeniable, yet it was not what defined the moment. It was the control, the restraint, the quiet confidence that never needed to announce itself. The piece moved into its final progression, a sequence that demanded both strength and subtlety, and Margaret delivered both without hesitation. Her left hand anchored the structure with unwavering stability, while her right hand carried the melody forward with a clarity that cut through the silence like light through glass. The balance was exact, the timing flawless, each phrase building upon the last until the music reached a point where it no longer felt like sound alone, but something shared, something understood without words. Whitmore took another small step back, the movement almost imperceptible, but enough to reveal the shift within him. His eyes no longer searched for errors. They followed, absorbing, recognizing. Around him, the audience had completely surrendered to the moment. No one whispered. No one moved. Even the faint hum of the building's ventilation system seemed to fade into nothing. The hall existed only within the music now. Margaret's expression remained unchanged, her eyes steady, her posture composed, as though none of this surprised her, as though she had always known exactly how this would unfold. And perhaps she had. The final notes approached, not with urgency, but with quiet certainty. There was no dramatic flourish, no exaggerated finish. Just a controlled, deliberate closing that resolved every phrase that had come before it. Her fingers slowed, each note spaced with intention, allowing the sound to linger, to settle, to complete itself fully. And then, with a final gentle motion, her hands lifted from the keys. The last note hung in the air, suspended for a heartbeat longer than expected, before fading into complete silence. No applause came. Not immediately, because no one seemed ready to break what had just been created. The room did not react. It absorbed. And in that silence, deeper than any sound that had filled it moments before, one truth stood unmistakably clear, not spoken, not announced, but understood by every single person present. They had not witnessed a simple woman being forced to play. They had witnessed something far greater, something that had quietly, completely, and irreversibly changed the room. The silence did not shatter. It unraveled slowly, like something fragile that no one wanted to disturb, until a single sound broke through, one pair of hands coming together in a quiet, deliberate clap. It came from the front row, from the senior instructor who had recognized what he was hearing long before anyone else. His expression held no hesitation now, only respect. The sound echoed softly through the hall, and for a brief second, it stood alone. Then another joined, and another, until the room, once frozen in disbelief, rose into a wave of applause that filled every corner of the space. It was not the polite, measured clapping reserved for students. It was something deeper, something earned. Margaret remained seated for a moment longer, her hands resting gently in her lap, her gaze still lowered as if the performance had not fully released her yet. When she finally stood, it was without flourish, without any attempt to acknowledge the intensity of the reaction around her. She simply stepped back from the bench with the same quiet composure she had carried onto the stage. Professor Whitmore did not clap. Not at first. He stood there, unmoving, his eyes fixed on Margaret as the realization settled more completely into place. The control he had once held over the room was gone, replaced by something far more uncomfortable. Accountability. The audience noticed. They always did. A few glances shifted toward him, subtle but unmistakable, as if waiting to see how he would respond now that the moment had turned. Whitmore inhaled slowly, his shoulders rising just slightly, and then, almost reluctantly, his hands came together. The sound was softer than the rest, less certain, but it was there, and it was enough to confirm what everyone already understood. Margaret stepped away from the piano, her path leading her back toward the wings, toward the same quiet space she had occupied before any of this began. But she did not disappear into it immediately. A voice stopped her. Wait. It came from the senior instructor in the front row, now standing, his presence commanding attention in a different way than Whitmore ever had. The applause began to quiet again, not out of obligation, but out of curiosity. The instructor took a few steps forward, his eyes never leaving Margaret. What is your name? He asked, his tone steady, respectful. Margaret paused. For the first time since she had taken the stage, she looked up, meeting his gaze without hesitation. Margaret Cole, she said simply. The name moved through the room in a soft murmur, repeated quietly from person to person, as if trying to attach meaning to something they had only just begun to understand. The instructor nodded once, as though confirming something to himself. How long have you been playing? The question lingered, heavier than it sounded. Margaret considered it for a moment, not searching for an answer, but choosing how to give it. A long time, she replied calmly. There was no elaboration. No need for it. The answer carried everything it needed to. Whitmore shifted again, stepping forward now, as if trying to reclaim a position that no longer belonged to him. Miss Cole, he began, his voice measured, though the edge within it had softened. Perhaps you should have mentioned your background. Margaret turned slightly toward him, her expression unchanged, her posture still composed. You did not ask, she said. The words were not sharp. They were not confrontational. They were simple, and that simplicity carried more weight than any argument could have. A hush followed, deeper than before, not from shock this time, but from recognition. Whitmore had no immediate response. The authority in his stance faltered, replaced by something quieter, something more human. Margaret inclined her head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than submission, and then continued toward the wings. The applause did not return immediately. It was not needed, because what remained in the room was not the echo of sound, but the presence of something far more lasting. Respect, earned without announcement, without demand, revealed only when it could no longer be ignored. And as Margaret disappeared from view, the hall did not feel the same as it had before she stepped onto that stage. It could not, because that day, without raising her voice, without seeking attention, she had changed the measure by which everyone in that room would judge another person ever again. The hallway outside the recital hall felt different the moment Margaret stepped into it, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound, as if the weight of what had just happened had followed her beyond the stage and settled into the space around her. The polished floors reflected the soft overhead lights, and for a brief moment, she paused, her hand resting lightly against the wall as though grounding herself in something familiar. Behind her, the distant echo of applause still lingered, muffled now, fading with each passing second. Inside the hall, the audience had not immediately returned to normal. Conversations resumed slowly, uncertain at first, as though people were still trying to process what they had witnessed. The senior instructor remained standing near the front, his gaze fixed on the empty stage where Margaret had just been, his expression thoughtful, almost unsettled. He turned slightly toward the other faculty members seated nearby. We need to find out who she really is, he said quietly, not as a command, but as a realization that could no longer be ignored. A few nodded in agreement, their earlier assumptions now replaced by a growing curiosity that bordered on urgency. Professor Whitmore stood alone near the piano, his reflection faintly visible in its glossy surface. The instrument that had once symbolized his authority now felt like something else entirely, a reminder of a moment he could not undo. He reached out, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the keys, but he did not press them. For the first time in years, he hesitated. In the hallway, Margaret resumed walking, her steps steady, her expression unchanged, as if the world had not shifted around her at all. A young student who had slipped out of the hall early spotted her from a distance and froze, unsure whether to approach. After a brief moment of hesitation, he stepped forward. Ms. Cole, he called, his voice respectful, careful. Margaret turned slightly, acknowledging him with a calm glance. That, what you played, he began, struggling to find the right words. I have been studying piano for 12 years, and I have never heard anything like it. Margaret listened without interrupting, her posture relaxed, her presence steady. The student continued, his voice softer now. Why are you working here? I mean, why are you not on that stage every day? The question hung in the air, not disrespectful, but genuine. Margaret considered him for a moment, her eyes steady, as though weighing not the question, but the understanding behind it. Not every stage is meant to be seen, she replied quietly. The student frowned slightly, trying to grasp the meaning, but before he could respond, another voice entered the space. Ms. Cole. It was Whitmore. He had followed her out, his usual composure noticeably altered, his steps slower, more deliberate. Margaret turned to face him fully now. For a brief second, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with everything that had just taken place. Whitmore cleared his throat, his gaze shifting briefly before returning to her. I misjudged you, he said, the words measured, but sincere in a way that did not come easily to him. Margaret did not respond immediately. She simply held his gaze, not challenging, not dismissing, just present. Whitmore continued, his voice quieter now. That will not happen again. There was no grand apology, no attempt to undo the past few hours. Just a recognition, offered in the only way he seemed capable of. Margaret inclined her head slightly, acknowledging his words without amplifying them. People see what they expect to see, she said calmly. Until they do not. Whitmore absorbed that, the meaning settling deeper than he anticipated. The student standing nearby remained silent, aware that he was witnessing something more significant than a simple exchange. Margaret turned once more, continuing down the hallway, her figure gradually blending back into the quiet rhythm of the building. This time, no one mistook her presence for something insignificant. Behind her, Whitmore remained where he stood, watching until she disappeared from view, the weight of the moment still resting heavily on his shoulders. And in that quiet corridor, far from the stage and the applause, the true shift had already taken place, not in the performance itself, but in the way it had rewritten what everyone thought they understood about value, about presence, and about the quiet power of someone who never needed to announce who they were. The building did not return to its usual rhythm that evening, not completely, because something unseen had shifted beneath its polished floors and quiet hallways, something that could not be undone by routine or ignored by those who had witnessed it. Margaret continued her work the next morning exactly as she always had, arriving early, her steps measured, her presence unobtrusive as she moved through the corridors with a cart of cleaning supplies. The soft hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of scales being practiced filled the air, familiar and unchanged on the surface. Yet the people within that space were not the same. A group of students who had once walked past her without a second glance now paused, their conversations faltering as she passed. One of them, a young woman clutching sheet music, gave a small, respectful nod. Margaret returned it with the same calm composure, neither inviting attention nor avoiding it. She simply continued. In one of the practice rooms, a conversation unfolded in hushed tones. That was her, right? One student asked, his voice low but urgent. The one from last night. Another nodded, glancing toward the hallway as if expecting her to appear again. I heard Professor Hale say she played like someone who had performed professionally. The word lingered in the air, heavy with implication. Professionally. It did not align with the image they had built in their minds. It did not fit the quiet woman with the gray cardigan and steady hands who wiped down piano keys at the end of each day. And yet, there was no denying what they had heard. Across the building, faculty members gathered in small clusters, their usual conversations replaced by speculation and quiet analysis. The senior instructor from the front row, now identified among colleagues as Professor Daniel Hale, stood near the administrative office, reviewing old faculty records with a focus that bordered on determination. There has to be something, he muttered, scanning through archived documents, his finger tracing down lists of past performers, guest artists, visiting lecturers. Names filled the pages, some familiar, others long forgotten, but none immediately connected. Not yet. Professor Whitmore entered the office a moment later, his presence drawing a brief silence from those nearby. The authority he once carried so effortlessly now felt altered, not diminished, but reshaped by something internal. He approached Hale, his tone measured. You are looking for her past. It was not a question. Hale glanced up, meeting his gaze. You are not. Whitmore paused, considering his answer. I am reconsidering my assumptions, he said finally. It was not a denial. It was something more honest. Hale studied him for a moment, then nodded slightly, as though acknowledging the shift. People like her do not simply appear without history, Hale said. They choose when to be seen. Whitmore absorbed that quietly, his expression thoughtful, as though the idea unsettled him more than he expected. Back in the hallway, Margaret finished wiping down the last piano in one of the smaller rehearsal rooms. Her movements were precise, efficient, no different from any other day. A young instructor stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment before speaking. You could teach here, she said, the words coming out more directly than she had intended. Margaret looked up, her expression calm. You have something that most of us spend years trying to understand. There was no envy in her voice, only sincerity. Margaret considered her briefly, then returned her attention to the piano, adjusting the cover with careful hands. Understanding does not always require a position, she replied. The instructor frowned slightly, unsure whether she agreed or simply did not yet understand. Margaret finished her task and moved toward the door, her presence passing by quietly, leaving the instructor standing there, reflecting on words that seemed simple but carried more weight the longer they settled. Throughout the day, the building continued to function. Lessons proceeded, rehearsals resumed, schedules were followed. But beneath it all, something remained different. The way people looked, the way they listened, the way they questioned what they thought they knew. And at the center of it all was a woman who moved through it without seeking recognition, without claiming space, and yet somehow redefining it simply by being present. By the time evening approached again, the story of what had happened the night before had spread beyond the walls of the conservatory, carried through conversations, retold with slight variations, but always ending in the same quiet conclusion. No one had expected her, and now no one could ignore her. Not because she demanded attention, but because she had shown, without effort, that true mastery does not need permission to exist. By the following week, the conservatory no longer whispered about Margaret Cole. It watched her, not openly, not with confrontation, but with a quiet awareness that followed her movements through every hallway, every room, every moment she chose to remain exactly who she had always been. The shift was subtle but undeniable. Doors were held open a second longer. Conversations softened when she passed. Even the most self-assured students, those who once measured their worth by competition and recognition, found themselves glancing toward her with something unfamiliar, not curiosity alone, but respect that had not been there before. Margaret did not change her routine. She arrived at the same time, pushed the same cart, wiped the same keys, and adjusted the same benches with the same careful precision. If anything, her consistency made the contrast even more striking. It was as though the world around her had recalibrated, while she remained untouched by its reaction. In one of the larger rehearsal halls, Professor Daniel Hale stood beside a group of advanced students. His usual lecture paused mid-thought. Technique is not enough, he said, his voice measured, carrying across the room. You can master every scale, every piece, every performance requirement, and still fall short. He paused, letting the silence settle before continuing. Because mastery is not just what you can do when people are watching. It is what you carry when no one is looking. The students listened differently now. They knew what he meant, even if he did not say her name. Across campus, Professor Whitmore had changed as well, though not in a way that drew attention to itself. His critiques remained sharp, his expectations high, but something in his tone had shifted, less dismissive, more deliberate. He no longer interrupted as quickly. He listened longer. And when a student struggled, he did not turn it into spectacle. The memory of that night lingered in him, not as embarrassment, but as a quiet correction he could not ignore. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the tall windows and stretched across the polished floors, Whitmore entered a smaller practice room where Margaret was finishing her work. He paused at the doorway, watching her for a moment before speaking. There is a recital next month, he said, his voice steady, controlled. Margaret did not turn immediately. She finished adjusting the piano cover, smoothing it into place before facing him. There always is, she replied calmly. Whitmore stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a soft click. This one is different, he continued. It will be attended by donors, critics, visiting faculty. He hesitated, then added, "You should play." The words hung in the air, not as a command, not even as a request, but as an offering that carried more weight than either of them acknowledged aloud. Margaret regarded him quietly, her expression unchanged. For a moment, it seemed as though she might decline without hesitation, as she had declined so many things before. But instead, she asked, "Why?" Whitmore did not answer immediately. He considered the question, not searching for a justification, but for something honest. "Because what you have should not remain unseen," he said finally. It was not a statement of authority. It was a recognition. Margaret studied him for a brief moment, then turned her gaze toward the piano, her hand resting lightly against its edge. The room remained still, the air carrying the weight of possibility. "Not everything needs an audience," she said. Quietly, Whitmore absorbed that, the response settling deeper than he expected. "No," he replied after a moment. "But some things change people when they are heard." The words lingered between them, not pressing, not demanding, simply existing as truth offered without expectation. Margaret did not respond right away. Instead, she looked down at the keys, her fingers brushing lightly across them without pressing, as though feeling something beneath the surface. Outside the room, footsteps passed, voices carried faintly through the hallway, life continuing as it always had. But inside, the moment held its ground. Finally, Margaret stepped back, her hand leaving the piano as she met Whitmore's gaze once more. "We will see," she said. It was not agreement. It was not refusal. It was something in between, something that left the future open without surrendering control. Whitmore nodded once, accepting it for what it was. As he turned to leave, he paused at the door, glancing back briefly before stepping out into the hallway. Margaret remained where she was, the quiet room settling around her once more. And in that stillness, one truth became clearer than ever, not spoken, not declared, but understood in the way the moment lingered long after it had passed. Some people do not step into the light because they need it. They step into it only when it serves a purpose greater than being seen. The night of the next recital arrived with a different kind of anticipation, one that carried quiet tension beneath its polished surface, because word had spread far beyond the conservatory, not through announcements or posters, but through conversations, through memory, through the kind of story that people repeated carefully, as if afraid of losing its truth. The hall was fuller than usual, every seat occupied, the soft glow of chandeliers reflecting off rows of attentive faces. Faculty members stood along the walls, students filled the aisles, and among them were guests who had never attended before, drawn by something they could not quite explain. Backstage, Margaret Cole stood alone near the edge of the curtain, her hands resting calmly at her sides, her gray cardigan replaced by a simple dark dress that carried the same quiet elegance as everything else about her. She did not adjust her posture. She did not rehearse movements. She simply waited, her presence steady, grounded, unchanged by the weight of expectation surrounding her. Professor Whitmore stood a few steps away, not directing, not instructing, but observing, his role altered in a way that no longer required authority to define it. When the final scheduled performer concluded and the applause settled into a respectful hush, Whitmore stepped forward, his voice carrying across the hall with clarity, but without the sharp edge it once held. "Tonight," he said, pausing briefly, "we will conclude with something unannounced." The audience leaned in, curiosity sharpening into focus. "A performance that reminds us why we are here in the first place." He stepped back, turning slightly toward the wings, not gesturing, not calling, simply allowing the moment to open on its own. Margaret stepped onto the stage. No dramatic entrance. No introduction beyond what had already been felt in the room. Just a quiet presence walking into the light, her steps measured, her gaze steady. The hall recognized her immediately, not through name, but through memory. The subtle shift moved across the audience again, the same silence from before, but deeper now, more aware. She reached the piano and sat without hesitation, her posture aligned, her hands resting briefly in her lap. There was no announcement of the piece, no explanation, no preparation offered to the audience. And yet, no one needed it. Because this time, they were not waiting for a mistake. They were ready to listen. Margaret lifted her hands, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to hold its breath again. Then the first note sounded. It was different from before, not because of the music itself, but because of what the room now understood. The sound did not need to prove anything. It simply existed, full, clear, undeniable. The melody unfolded with the same quiet mastery, but now it carried something more, a shared awareness between performer and audience, a recognition that had not been there before. Faces softened, shoulders relaxed. The tension that had once been built on expectation dissolved into something else entirely. Appreciation. Margaret played without looking up, her focus complete, her presence unbroken, her control absolute. Each phrase moved seamlessly into the next, the music filling the hall not with force, but with clarity that resonated deeper than sound alone. Professor Whitmore stood at the edge of the stage, his gaze fixed not on her hands this time, but on the room itself, watching the effect, the transformation, the quiet shift that moved through every person present. This was not spectacle. This was understanding. As the piece reached its final passage, the hall remained still, not out of uncertainty, but out of respect for the moment as it unfolded. The final notes came with the same deliberate grace, each one allowed to settle fully before giving way to silence. And when her hands lifted from the keys, the quiet that followed was not hesitation. It was reverence. Then the applause came, not sudden, not explosive, but rising steadily, deeply, until it filled the room with something that could not be mistaken. Not surprise, not disbelief, recognition. Margaret stood, turning slightly toward the audience, her expression calm, unchanged, her presence exactly as it had always been. She did not bow deeply. She did not seek the moment. She simply acknowledged it. And in that simplicity, the message became unmistakable, not spoken, not announced, but understood by everyone in that hall. Respect is not given to those who demand to be seen. It is revealed by those who never needed to prove who they were in the first place. And that night, the room did not just hear music. It remembered what dignity sounds like.